Is it working?
It was hot. It was better than it being really cold.
I think when I opened up Skype, it had to update. So I think there might be an update that has to be installed.
Oh man. Oh, Charles, can you teach the class?
Oh, there he is.
There he is.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is.
I was wondering what was going on. I was calling, and there was just no answer. So I closed the program and restarted it, and now it's working. Very good.
Mystery.
Yeah, very strange. I'm going to put you up there. Oh, let's see here. Okay, after that 10-minute delay, it must have been raining.
We have to go till 8:10 though now.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, let's. I guess can Griswold hear me? Griswold.
Yes.
I guess.
We can
Okay,
hear
I
you.
can't see.
Our camera just isn't working for some reason.
Okay, that's fine. It didn't work last week, so we can do with that. There's something showing up that's strange. Okay, I'm going to close that. You still there? And can Mount St. Francis hear us okay?
Yeah, we're all here.
Okay, well, very good.
We're all here, not all there. All except for Father Lewis.
Okay. Well, then, why don't we begin with a word of prayer? We'll just invoke Our Lady and the Holy Spirit to guide our thoughts and have a good seminar. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary,
Holy
Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I don't know if this is public information, but I heard a rumor that one of the friars is in the process of translating Mingus's two-volume theological and philosophical manual of Duns Scotus, published posthumously in 1930. Is that rumor true?
Yes.
Very good. Very good.
Well, not the prior part.
Yeah.
Just the past.
Wait, who's doing that?
What was that? I didn't catch that. I'm sorry.
Is it not the prior part, just the postulate?
Oh, okay. Do you have any idea how long it will take to get ready?
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's going to be quite a while, just based on the amount of time that I'll have to do it. I've only really just started, so.
And then, are you thinking of just using this privately, or are you thinking of publishing it through the academy or somewhere else?
Well, it would certainly need a lot of editing, but once that were done, if I were to bring this to completion, then yeah, it would certainly be for public use. But Father Lewis would be the person that you would talk to about that. It's under obedience that I'm doing it, not so much just.
Well, sometimes obedience can be pleasurable. Father Lewis is, what did he say? His burden is light and his yoke is easy.
That's right. Although Scotus never said that, so.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, Alex, you might be interested in that at some point.
Yeah.
I know you're close to the university press there, and with some academic editing and some updating according to the critical edition, that would be, I think, a killer entree into the thought of Scotus.
Right.
I'll show you what it is. I think I've shown you this before, but it's this volume set.
Right.
And that would be a wonderful, very useful thing. One moment, I'll be right back. I need to shut a window. I'm hearing some noise from outside.
So what's the name? Sorry, the person who was speaking about translating it. What's your name?
Adrian?
And how do I? Can you email me so I have your contact information?
Sure. Yeah.
So just my email is just my name, alexplato@gmail.com.
All right.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is exciting. Let's see. Today I want to go through the first 4 questions of the De Scientia Christi. Were you all able to get a copy of that and look it over?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Good. Great. I think the translation's in the main pretty good. On question, let me think about it now. Probably question 3, there'll be a point where I want to clarify something through the Latin text, which helps clarify, I think, Bonaventure's meaning. But we'll try to move quickly through this in order to make some progress. But before we move into that, are there any questions about previous week's general stuff? Doesn't sound like. Okay. Well, in the first place, then, as you've probably noticed, just some preliminary remarks. The De Scientia Christi comprises 7 questions, 3 on God's knowledge as infinite and how he knows created things. 1 question, the middle question, the pivotal question on the knowledge of Christ pertaining to both, well, primarily to his human knowledge in terms of and in discussion with Aristotle and Augustine, especially with respect to abstraction and illumination, and then 3 final questions having to do with the modes of Christ's wisdom. And as I mentioned before, you can look at this text in a kind of ring structure, or you can look at it in terms of a chiasm, where it turns back on itself in the ring structure and kind of ends where it begins, or with the chiasm. You can move through questions 1, 2, and 3 and see 5 as question 4 as the pivotal question, and then 3, 5, 6, and 7 as a recapitulation in in terms of created wisdom of the first 3 questions. Beginning with infinite wisdom and ending with the human soul of Christ actually achieving and residing in a kind of perfected created wisdom. So with those observations in mind, we'll move into some general commentary on the text. This set of questions discusses the question of knowledge in its 2 modes, divine and human, obviously presupposing Bonaventure's notion or understanding of being, which he will discuss more fully in the disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ, and then kind of synthesize with what he did in the De Scientia Christi in his Itinerarium Mentis and Deum. So that's an important caveat. Bonaventure is presupposing some notion of knowledge in terms of his understanding of being. And being for him exists or is instantiable in 2 modes. Finite and infinite, contingent, necessary, dependent, independent, all of these disjunctions, what you might call transcendental disjunctions, because being itself is not something that is contained in the categories. Rather, all the categories, meaning Aristotle's categories, are known in virtue of being as transcendental. So then within being itself, we can see these various modes, finite, infinite. And then for Bonaventure, his understanding of being reduces to first being or infinite being. And this first being or infinite being is a spiritual being endowed with memory, intellect, and will. So perfect being for Bonaventure is personal being, and personal being is a rational being. And so ultimately being must be conceived of and analyzed in terms of perfect or infinite being. And in the first 3 questions of the disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ, God's being discussed, or knowledge is being discussed in terms of God's infinite knowledge. And so in this sense then, this is the foundation of Bonaventure's theory. It's based upon being and ultimately being is personal, and thus a key component of a personal being is intelligence or knowledge. So that's where Bonaventure begins. Just to start us off, because you'll run across several terms in Bonaventure, such as, similitude, divine art, divine ideas, the eternal art, those notions. It's helpful to get a handle or a map in terms of how Bonaventure actually uses these notions with respect to divine knowledge. And so in the Breviloquium, the first part of the Breviloquium, chapter 8, Bonaventure provides a summary outline or discussion of all these terms that he uses, especially the terms idea with respect to the divinity, the word or a spoken word as a concept with respect to the divinity, art, and also ratio. Okay? And so let's just begin there, trying to understand, how Bonaventure breaks down these notions, or his notion of divine knowledge according to what God knows and the terms that he uses for what God knows. So in the first sense, Bonaventure describes God's knowledge in terms of an absolute perfection of his being. An absolute perfection of his being is simply an essential quality of a perfect spiritual being. God has knowledge because God has intellect. And because God's intellect and knowledge are identical with his perfect spiritual essence, he must have perfect knowledge. And this is Bonaventure's, what he calls the most simple knowledge of all things. And so he describes then several disjuncts with respect to God's simple knowledge. And so he says, all other things from him are known in himself and through himself. In himself, because his knowledge is a perfection of his own being, and through himself, because his essence, considered under the aspect of truth, produces all true things that are to be known. And so on and so forth. So he speaks about knowledge of created things. He knows them in an uncreated way. Knowledge of dependent things, he knows them in an independent way. Knowledge of temporal things, he knows them in an eternal way. And these are all just simply derivations from Bonaventure's understanding of divine simplicity. Okay? So simplicity just simply means it's independent, non-composed, perfectly actual. Bonaventure says, along with Aquinas, it's pure actuality, or purus actus. And so this is a statement about God's essential perfection by nature. Then, going back then, in the first sense, you might say then God knows things in virtue of his most simple essence. But God is also perfect, or complete. And his perfection pertains more to the notion of God's essential attribute of infinity. And so if simplicity pertains to the divine being's non-composedness and independence, infinity has to do with a kind of fullness or absolute perfection that Bonaventure uses the term infinity for, with respect to not a material quantity that can always be added to or diminished, but rather a maximal mode of spiritual perfection. Thus, God also contains in himself all knowable items because he knows all truth, because he is the source or exemplar of truth. He knows all knowable items, whether possible, actual, past, present, future, all of those things he knows, and Bonaventure ascribes that to his perfection or his infinity. And so the first main division then, when thinking of divine knowledge, is thinking of it in terms of God's simplicity on the one hand, or thinking of it in terms of God's infinity on the other hand. But even within infinity, Bonaventure then subdivides between knowledge as we speak of it, or as we talk about it, and knowledge in terms of what God actually possesses in himself. So Bonaventure will say, we can speak of knowledge in a certain way, but we also simply just understand that God has in himself, by his infinity, the ideas of all things, all knowable things, possible or actual, and so on and so forth. And thus, Bonaventure can say God has an infinite number of ideas. Up to the way we speak about divine knowledge, in that division following upon knowledge based upon perfection, Bonaventure then helpfully subdivides in terms of what God actually knows as the term of his knowledge, or the complete perfection of his knowledge, and then what God knows, or thinking in terms of what God knows by means of how he knows it, how we explain what he knows. And so he says, when speaking about God's knowledge, we can think of it in terms of what he actually knows, on the one hand, or thinking of it in terms of how he knows, or the means by which he knows. And this is where the discussion of the divine ideas and the exemplars come into play. So then moving back to how we speak, or how God's knowledge is spoken of, he divides it into what God actually knows and the means by which he knows. So what Bonaventure says, or the terms he uses in Latin, is ut cognoscivata, or cognoscitiva, excuse me, and ut ratio cognoscendi. Now, those terms simply refer to the first term, as cognoscitiva, means as known. And the second, the ratio cognoscendi, refers to, okay, we admit God knows everything, but how in God does he, if we're going to imagine it in terms of structural, not chronological moments, but structural moments that explain how he comes to arrive at what he knows, this is in terms of the ratio cognoscendi. And this term, translated into English, basically means the reasons by which God knows, or the reasons for knowing something. So we can distinguish, when speaking of God's knowledge, between what he actually knows as a kind of static point of arrival, and the means or the reasons for which he knows. And so do we have those two divisions clear? Because then he subdivides this into several. So if you're charting this, move back up to the yes, Alex.
I'm sorry, I had a problem with my computer and I missed the two. What were the two?
The two distinctions that Bonaventure draws with respect to divine knowledge in how we speak of it, or how his divine knowledge is spoken of, are between that which he knows in terms of the static possession of knowledge and the principle of knowledge, and that by which he knows, or how the reasons that God has in his own essence as truth, and as truth being productive of all knowable items, how he in a sense, I don't want to say it's not through a process, but he calls these ideas the ratio cognoscendi, meaning these are the means or the reasons by which he knows. So the ratio cognoscendi of a cat is distinct from the ratio cognoscendi of a dog. But he knows a dog and he knows a cat. But there are also the reasons by which his knowledge terminates in knowledge of catness or dogness, or this cat or this dog. And so he distinguishes then God's knowledge as possessed, or God's knowledge as distinct according to the reasons that he has this knowledge that we speak of, or that we predicate of God or attribute to him.
And what was the Latin term for the first type? The Latin term for the second ratio cognoscendi?
Ut cognoscitiva.
Okay.
And the other one is ut ratio cognoscendi.
Okay.
And so moving up to the first type, the ut cognoscitiva, he subdivides this kind of knowledge, and you'll see how he uses the terms. He subdivides this kind of knowledge into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different modes, which correspond in terms of their actual perfection to 5 modes in the ratio cognoscendi. But this will help you map onto when he's using the word art or exemplar or similitude. We're going to arrive at that, but it's important to see how he's using these terms because they're presupposed and built into what he explains in the De Scientia Christi. So as you probably noticed, Bonaventure asserts that God knows all possible beings. And he knows all possible beings through what he calls a knowledge of simple intelligence. You remember that? Let's see here.
Is this one of those modes?
Yes. Let's see, where does he speak of it? In the De Scientia. I think I read it. Anyway, well, if he doesn't, and I missed it, or I'm just confusing it with another text, this is even more important. So he says God's knowledge of all possible things is just simply a knowledge of simple intelligence. In this, he says, again, now notice the means language. He says he arrives at this knowledge of simple intelligence of all possibles, he says per lucium, which is per is a term that means by means of, through the light as expressed in a medium. And this medium is used metaphorically and located in the essence itself of God. So God arrives at a knowledge of simple intelligence as he knows things through the light, what he calls the light of the uncreated truth. Then it says he knows the light of existing things through the knowledge of vision. So if he knows things through a simple intelligence, he also knows existing things through vision. And this is a metaphor where he just has these things in some way present to his intellect and to his knowledge. And he also knows, in terms of vision, he distinguishes between vision in a general sense and then his knowledge of good operations or works, the knowledge of good works. And this is what Bonaventure calls the knowledge of approbation. And then Bonaventure says this knowledge in God, we say, is per speculum, or through a mirror. Now, what's that mirror going to be? Well, we'll see in the second half of this division. God also knows future things. And he also knows what he will do in terms of disposing things to happen. He knows future things. Bonaventure, his divine knowledge of future things, Bonaventure calls foreknowledge or prescience, prescientia. And he also knows what he will do or what he will make, and he calls this knowledge not prescientia, but dispositio, or a disposing or an ordering. And this, Bonaventure says, this knowledge is through the exemplar, per exemplar. And now this touches upon, exemplary ideas. What's he doing here? So he's explaining how God arrives at all these various modes of knowledge through the means that he will discuss in the second division in terms of ratio cognoscendi. So you can see both accounts are closely interwoven. And then finally, Bonaventure has another division and a final division in these modes of divine knowledge as achieved, you might say. God has this knowledge. He speaks of election and reprobation. Okay? And this has to do with God's providence. Election, reprobation. And he calls, election, predestination, and reprobation, reprobation. And he says he knows these items of knowledge through the metaphor of the book of life. Okay, so God knows the predestination and the reprobate through what he calls the book of life. Now, just to look ahead a little bit to the De Scientia Christi, the De Mysterio Trinitatis, the first question, Article 2, he will discuss at length this Liber Vitae, this book of life. And this book of life is the third book that Bonaventure speaks of. We've already seen the book of creation and the book of scripture. Well, this book of life is basically God's secret providence in terms of predestination of the elect and reprobation of the damned. And so this book of life is fourth way that Bonaventure describes as, or a fourth term or a metaphor that Bonaventure uses to explain God's knowledge as achieved. So within God, Bonaventure posits these quasi-media, and they're not true media, but they're ways of explaining the distinctness of both the modes of God's knowledge, vision, approbation, foreknowledge. It's a way of explaining the modes as well as the distinct items of God's knowledge. Bonaventure develops an elaborate account of this, trying to maintain both fidelity to the patristic tradition as well as the scriptural tradition in conversation, continuous conversation with his contemporaries and the newly discovered and imposed Aristotle. And so let's move then from the first way of speaking of God's knowledge, or the first way about which God's knowledge is spoken of, the ut cognoscitiva, to the ut ratio cognoscendi. Now this ratio cognoscendi, go ahead, somebody have a question?
Yeah, right before that, could you just list one by one the 5 in a row?
Yes.
Yes. In that first division, the ut cognoscitiva, Bonaventure lists knowledge of possibles. He calls this the knowledge of simple intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And he says this knowledge is achieved or manifest, or a better Bonaventurian term is principiated through the light, the uncreated light of truth, the light of the divine being. The light of the divine being just shines out in a kind of primordial simplicity, all things that are knowable. So in the first instance of all things not God, they're just merely possibles. God knows all possibles, right? But then he, through a will act, he knows actually existing things. So he calls the knowledge, this is the second category now, he calls the knowledge of existing things a knowledge of vision. So it's not simple intelligence that is just all in God. Now this knowledge of existing things is in some way directed towards created terms as existing, in a sense, independent subsistences and created orders. He calls this the knowledge of vision. And then underneath that, or closely related to the knowledge of vision, he divides this knowledge of approbation of good works. He sees or affirms good works through his knowledge of approbation. And then Bonaventure says this knowledge in God is metaphorically achieved through the mirror. Now, what does that mean, through the mirror? Per speculum. Well, per speculum, speculum simply means he's seeing his knowledge reflected in created things. It's not a knowledge of simple intelligence that just sees his own essence and everything that he can do and know in terms of himself. So he's now seeing his knowledge and through his will acts being reflected in created entities. So that's why he says per speculum.
He sees his goodness reflected, or his knowledge?
He sees both.
Okay.
But he calls the any existing thing and knowledge of good works, which he calls the knowledge of approbation. He sees this through the mirror reflected according to his will and according to his prior eternal knowledge. But this is actualized, and Bonaventure calls this vision. It's actualized in time and space. And then the second, or moving down one, he speaks of the knowledge of future happenings, future events, future states of affairs. And he calls this knowledge simply foreknowledge. Right? What he has willed will take place. This is a knowledge he calls foreknowledge. And then underneath foreknowledge are those things that will be done or should be done by God, that are fitting according to his own good will and good pleasure. And that's what's called disposition or dispositio. Okay? So you have 3 couplets so far. you have possible, and those are things of anything God can know and God can do. He knows those in virtue of his own existence. Then you have the first couplet, which is existence and of good works. And he says, these things are known through vision and through approbation, through the mirror, per speculum. Then he has a second couplet, which is knowledge of future things and knowledge of what he should do, what is fitting for him to do in the created order, according to his good will. And this he calls the knowledge of foreknowledge, prescientia, and dispositio. And he says these things God knows through or per exemplar. And so we've got to be thinking, okay, we've got now this notion of exemplar, right? Because exemplary ideas are what are at issue in the De Christi. And then finally, the third moment has to do with those people who will be saved, the elect, and those people who will be reprobated, the damned. And Bonaventure calls this knowledge of God, or the divine knowledge, predestinatio, or predestination, and reprobatio, or reprobation. And he says this knowledge is per liber vitae, through the book of life. Okay? So you have these three couplets that follow and flow out of simple intelligence, and there's a kind of order, a kind of logical order, where the as you move down the list, each of these presupposes in some way the prior. Moving from God's eternal and infinite act of knowing to the present, to the future, to the eschaton. Does that make sense? And so God knows through the light, which is just his eternal being reflecting all that's knowable and all that's possible, per lucium. And then he knows things in their created existence, again, through his own ideas, but he knows them in their existence as they reflect, or as he reflects himself through these created entities. And he says that's per speculum, or through the mirror. And then he knows future events and what he's going to do, or what he should do providentially, through the exemplary ideas. And then finally, the eschatological state of all things through the book of life, that has to do with reprobation and election. Yes, Dr. Plato.
You referred to three couplets.
Yes.
And so the first item, not a couplet, it's just his knowledge of
It's just simple intelligence. That's right.
And then there's three couplets.
That's right.
And then so if I count each couplet as one, I'm up to four now. Is there a fifth?
No, we have only four.
Okay.
It's per lucium, per speculum, per exemplar, and per liber vitae. Those are the four modes that we can speak of God having achieved knowledge in Bonaventure's philosophical theology of divine knowledge. Okay, now moving from this first mode of knowledge to the second as ratio cognoscendi. So we move from as what God knows in terms of achieved knowledge, we move from an account of what God knows by the means, per lucium, per speculum. Now we're reversing the order. We're going from, okay, it's through these means that he achieves knowledge. So we're now speaking primarily of the means while averting to what God actually knows in the termination of his act of knowledge. Okay? Does that make sense, this distinction? Now he's kind of reversing the orders. Okay, in the first sense of the ut ratio cognoscendi, we can say that God knows all things. He knows everything. Right? He knows everything. This knowledge of everything he just simply calls lux. Now, in the first mode of knowledge, he said per lucium. Per lucium, now he calls it just lux. Now, if we look at per lucium in terms of as a medium or a ground of explanation for God's knowledge of simple intelligence, we can say that lux is just simply the light at the source. Now we're referring to God himself as light, the light of truth, the light of intelligence. So that's what Bonaventure calls lux. When we say God knows everything, the ratio cognoscendi of God knowing everything is that he is lux. He's just the light itself. Okay? In the second, then, we can speak of let's see. This is. We can speak of things moving forth or proceeding forth from God in terms of knowledge, and this is again corresponding to vision, visio, and approbata, approbation. Bonaventure says this is just again the mirror. God is the mirror. His ideas themselves serve as a mirror which reflect his own truth upon created things and reflect his own truth back to himself. So there's a kind of mirror relationship where the truth of God's ideas have a reflective aspect. Bonaventure just calls this simply speculum. Let's see here. Then the third is we can speak of how things actually move or proceed in their being through time. Bonaventure links up to prevision, foreknowledge, and disposition. So you see how both sides of this distinction map onto one another. But this is what Bonaventure calls the exemplar, and the exemplar are the key topics of, again, divine illumination and God's knowledge as infinite, and as through the exemplars or similitudes in questions 1 through 3 of the De Scientia. Now here's where exemplar then becomes, God is just simply the exemplar of all knowable things because he's infinite truth, he's infinite light, okay? But then under exemplar, Bonaventure then subdivides 4 terms that he in a sense uses with subtle connotational distinction with reference to this notion of God as exemplar. Or the reason that God knows everything is because he is the exemplar. And these 4 terms are the idea. You talk about a divine idea. Another term is verbum, the word spoken conceptually. The word art, which has to do with the means by which an artificer or a creator acts. The knowledge that precedes willing or volition or providential ordering, and then finally ratio. And ratio has a whole range of connotations, but it simply here means a principle or a distinct principle, or in Scotistic terms, formality or quiddity of a given item of knowledge that designates this item of knowledge as distinct from that item of knowledge. So you could say the ratio of a cat is distinct from the ratio of a dog. And so the principle by which you know a cat is distinct from the principle or form or quiddity by which you know a dog. And then finally, he speaks of the return of all things, kind of in their consummation and fulfillment. And this, again, maps onto predestination and damnation or reprobation. And this just simply is because God in himself, because he writes the Liber Vitae, his knowledge of the return of created things are simply because God himself, in his simplicity of knowledge, can be called the Book of Life. Insofar as by act of his predestination and or reprobation, he knows the return of all things to their final state. Go ahead. Alex. Or Stefan, does somebody have a question?
Yeah, I had a question. So just to make sure I get this, 2 questions. First question is, what text are you getting this from? I missed that because my computer went out or something.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is from the Breviloquium.
Okay.
Let's see, I can find the chapter and verse.
I can find it too.
It's the Breviloquium, part 1, chapter 8.
Okay.
His discussion of God's wisdom. Bonaventure's discussion of divine wisdom. This is where he brings it all together and shows how all these terms relate to one another.
So part 1, section 8.
Yeah, part 1, section 8.
Okay, and my second one was just to see if I got this correct. The divine knowledge can be spoken of in two different ways. Basically, what's known and how/why it's known.
That's right.
Those are those two Latin things. So you walk through each one as what can be known, and now we ask, well, how does God know it, or why does he know it? So he knows everything because of he's the light, right?
That's right.
He knows everything because through vision. Okay. He knows everything by exemplarity, right? Because he makes it, so to speak. And he knows things because they return to him.
That's right.
Okay.
And there's a purpose.
Okay.
And so, again, remember, this is how Bonaventure is explaining the perfection of divine knowledge in terms of the perfection of the divine being, and perfection here maps closely onto his infinity, which is Bonaventure is using, and Scotus will make more hay of this when we get to him. Simplicity simply refers to a lack of composition. He's not dependent on parts that are prior to him. God is not dependent upon and not susceptible to increase or diminution. But it doesn't really actually fill out much conceptually or content-wise. And so then Bonaventure speaks of God's knowledge and God's being in terms of its perfection. But then in this notion of perfection, there's a notion of completeness or fullness, and he can pack a lot more into that discussion, especially if you think of perfection in terms of a quasi infinity or maximal realization or reality. Because then by using conceptual tools, you can carve up all these different perfections and speak of them distinctly, while still not while affirming divine infinity and not compromising divine simplicity. Because on the one hand, you want to say all these perfections are simply co-possible or compossible with simplicity, because simplicity implies infinity and vice versa. And infinity is just simply maximal perfection. And so when Bonaventure discusses infinity, he's able to open up a whole world of discussion about God's perfection, the distinct perfections of the divine being, namely, for example, simplicity, unity, eternity, necessity, all these absolute perfections. But he's also able to talk about God's memory, intellect, and will, and also then God's knowledge of distinct items. Somehow one idea is not simply and unqualifiedly identical to another idea, even though they're all really identical in terms of God's divine simplicity. So this is all rather complex, but I think it works out, at least conceptually and semantically, if you can see how he's carving up this discussion. And so, moving back then, one step in our outline, we've distinguished what is said of God as ut cognoscitiva, or as it is known, and ut ratio cognoscendi, as the reasons for knowing, or the reasons by which, in quotes, God knows something. So, okay, get back to dicitur, or what is said of divine knowledge. And then between dicitur, there's another division that is parallel to dicitur. And that is simply the affirmation that God has or possesses the knowledge of or ideas of all things. And that's just a simple way of affirming that by dint of God's infinite perfection, he has all the ideas. But it doesn't specify how we speak of this. And so that's another way that Bonaventure divides this. But one is just simply stating in a simple formulation what he describes under the aspect of what is said of divine infinity. So I imagine there are questions, points of clarification before we move on.
Jared, the text that you're talking about, the Breviloquium.
Yes.
I'm really off base here as far as the disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ. Is that the Breviloquium?
No, the Breviloquium, the disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ were written in 1254. They were the first set of disputed questions that we think Bonaventure engaged in publicly as a master of theology. He may have done others, but this is the first one that we know of. And so this was composed at the very beginning of his teaching career. The Breviloquium is rather a book published as a what should I say? A basic manual of dogmatic theology that attempts to briefly and in a short, concise text present the entire range of the topics of theology in a way that is clear and is easily understood, as well as easily translated and applied to the task of preaching. So the Breviloquium literally means a short word about theology that is useful as a handbook for preachers and confessors and for students. And so the Breviloquium was composed in 1257, right around the time that Bonaventure was elected Minister General of the entire Franciscan order. And so there was a clear pastoral, practical purpose for the Breviloquium that was not, in a sense, rooted in questions, the quaestio format of giving reasons for, giving reasons against, giving a response, that sort of format, nor was it a disputational kind of genre. It was rather just a simple presentation of here's what the faith teaches, and here are the reasons why we hold this as Christians. But it was entirely deductive, and it was entirely how would I say that? Assertive. Bonaventure is simply asserting what the church teaches and giving an explanation for the teaching. He's not engaging in questions. He's not engaging in a dialogue format. He's not engaging in disputation. And there's an English translation of this text.
Dr. Goff?
Yes.
I just scanned it in and emailed it to the people whose emails I had. So you should have it in your email. Dr. Plato should. And the 4 people in this room with me should. I don't know who I would have sent it to in New Bedford or Griswold.
Okay. Well, that's great. That is perfect. But in terms of genre, and just a historical aside, the Breviloquium, along with the Itinerarium of St. Bonaventure, were the 2 most copied books of Bonaventure in the High Middle Ages going forward to modern times. In fact, there were more manuscripts of the Breviloquium prior to printing that were in existence and discovered and still exist than the Itinerarium. If my memory serves, I think there were about 300 manuscripts of the Breviloquium to about 120 of the Itinerarium that are in existence. So the Breviloquium was a very popular book, and in terms of genre, there's no other book quite like it, because unlike the Summa or the commentary on the sentences, the format is not it's not a quaestio or a disputatio format. It's simply just a presentation, almost like a catechism, but briefer, of the faith. And in terms of a difference between this and the catechism, is it's not primarily let's see, what should I say? Its methodology is still logical and strictly deductive, whereas a typical catechism is more narrative and what should I say? Expository or explanatory. The Breviloquium is very, very clear in terms of what's being asserted and in terms of arriving at and moving through an explanation of what is asserted. So it's scholastic in that sense. It's rigorously logical, even if it's very brief. And Bonaventure's just simply proving his case. He's not entertaining any other positions. So it's a very valuable book in that sense. And you find summary treatments of many topics that Bonaventure discusses in the Breviloquium that help frame discussions in other places, but yet if you just look at that discussion in itself, if you're looking for a philosophical or a theological justification of a position, you'll be disappointed. So you can use these texts in tandem as mutually illuminating. Now, moving on. Any further questions? I gotta find my paper. Okay. So we talked a bit about divine knowledge. And then question 4. This will be an interesting discussion if we can get to it. So I want to move quickly through divine infinity to question 4. So we see on page 77 of your text. Let's just move right to 77. So question 1 asks whether the knowledge of Christ, in as far as he is the Word, actually extends to an infinite number of objects. And Bonaventure will answer in the affirmative. Now, clearly, he's talking about Christ. Why is he talking about Christ? Because Christ is, for Bonaventure, the centerpiece and linchpin and ultimately explanation of all true philosophy and theology. So he begins with Christ as the middle person of the Trinity, the mediator between God and man, and as man, the mediator in creation, composed of a spiritual and material natures. And so when he says whether Christ, insofar as he is the Word, he's predicating there his divine personhood, obviously hypostatically, but in virtue of this divine personhood, he's speaking of the divine essence or nature. So insofar as he is the Word means insofar as he is God by nature. Does he know an infinite number of things? And of course, Bonaventure says, yes, he does. And we won't go over the entire argument. If there are specific questions in any of these any of these disputed questions, please ask, because we don't have enough time to go through these very carefully. And certainly, I would suggest that each of these questions and the entirety of the disputed questions will repay repeated readings and reflection. So, question 1, page 77. Here you see Bonaventure distinguishing between 3 basic modes of divine knowledge. Page 77. And we've just discussed this. Go ahead, Alec.
Page 77. That must be not from this one. Is that right?
No, that's correct. It is this one.
Oh,
I think unless they had two different editions.
that's the conclusion in mine.
That's what I'm going to.
Okay.
The conclusion of question 1.
Okay.
So I want to move down. Bonaventure says God knows, he asserts, God knows and comprehends an infinite number of things with the knowledge of simple intelligence. So there's that first distinction. Simple intelligence, an infinite number of things. You see on page 77 where Bonaventure distinguishes 3 modes of divine knowledge, down towards the second full paragraph. Bonaventure writes, this line of argument is developed by more recent doctors who maintain that there are 3 modes of divine knowledge, not because of a difference in divine knowledge. And here he's referring to essence. There's no difference or separation in essence between these modes of divine knowledge, because that would impugn or run contrary to divine simplicity. So he says, not because of a difference in the divine knowledge itself, but because of a difference in the connotation. Now, connotation is a tricky word. Many Bonaventurian scholars simply take connotation to mean God knows things distinctly by virtue of the created things themselves that he creates. But this raises a difficulty with respect to God's simple intelligence, because if God's knowledge is by virtue of creation or of what his knowledge connotes outside of himself, well, then God's knowledge would simply be limited to what actually exists outside of himself. But many Bonaventure scholars take connote or connotation to refer to a creature rather than refer to a kind of virtual relation of the idea to a possibility that could be created or to an actuality that is created. So connote with Bonaventure just means simply that something is known along with something else. It doesn't necessarily refer to the external term of that knowledge, because again, God's knowledge is all internal. And so this is just to head off possible misunderstandings that Bonaventure's knowledge is not by virtue of possible things or of distinct things, by virtue of his actually having created X number of things. No, rather, God knows everything distinctly by distinct ideas that then have connotations that are distinct from the divine essence as the divine essence is understood in itself. So God understands his divine essence, but he also understands the essence or the idea of a cat. But it's not because he created a cat that he understands the cat. No, a cat is understandable and creatable because God already has an understanding of what a cat is or would be. So, going on then, in God there is a knowledge of approbation, a knowledge of vision, and a knowledge of intelligence. This simply is a repetition of what we just discussed. But Bonaventure is making this distinction. What is missing is the knowledge of, what is that? What are we missing? We're missing one.
The elect and reprobate.
We're missing the elect and reprobate, and we're also missing, I don't think there's a discussion of yet. There's not a discussion of foreknowledge here. So all he's speaking of here is a knowledge of vision, intelligence, and approbation. But this is important because he's trying to make the point that God knows an infinite number of items. And so according to this threefold division that he's accepting for the time being, he states, well, it can't be a knowledge of approbation because approbation refers to those things that are good and finite. So God's knowledge cannot just be simply of approbation because then it wouldn't be of an actual infinity of things. The knowledge of vision, however, has to do with everything that exists, whether good or bad. But again, whatever exists outside of God is finite. And so what does that leave us with? God has a knowledge of simple intelligence, and by dint of his knowledge of simple intelligence, he knows all possible things. And by implication, if he knows all possible things, if certain actualities are possible, he would know those as well. Because possibilities, moving on to the next page.
And he lumps in the knowledge of future right there.
Yeah, I just noticed that. That's right. For God, possibilities are not finite but infinite.
When I stumbled on that in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that God knows all possible contingencies, I was kind of dumbfounded. I mean, I realized the truth of it, but it's mind-boggling to think about that.
Yes, and it's difficult. Bonaventure wrestles with this number. What do you mean wrestles with this notion of infinite? Because at least in most, as far as I know, number systems, and this is how Bonaventure was working, infinity, in terms of numerical distinction, seems to be a notion that is ever only potential. And this is kind of what he's getting from Aristotle, too. Infinity always means you can add to it. There can always be one more to an infinity. There's a potential infinity. But Bonaventure wants to assert that the divine essence somehow is so transcendent by nature to even numerically distinct items or numerically distinguishable items, such as possibles, that somehow the divine essence contains even an infinite number of possibilities, even if infinity itself cannot be numbered. And so what he's doing is it seems to me he's moving from an epistemological, mathematical mode of presentation and discourse to a metaphysical mode of presentation and discourse. And Bonaventure just simply doesn't go much farther. I mean, he will say later on that God knows an actual infinity of ideas, and that this infinity is simply finite to himself, because he himself is essentially infinite in a different way, at least by implication. Let's see. Something to note is with Bonaventure, in terms of how he explains God's knowledge of an infinite number of ideas. He clearly affirms that God knows himself, and by dint of knowing himself, he seems to imply that he knows all other knowable things. But what he doesn't do is he actually doesn't give an account or a structural outline of how that's possible or should be understood. So, for example, by saying that the divine being is infinite, unlimited, and God knows his own essence, well, you're not saying the same thing with respect to infinity as you would say when speaking of distinct ideas. If God knows an infinite number of ideas, he knows these ideas as distinct, but that distinction somehow is not identical in its infinity, its infinite possibility, to what he's talking about when he says that the divine being itself is infinite. And thus, by dint of this prior infinity of the divine essence, somehow he knows all possible things, or an infinite number of possible ideas. And so, sometimes you're left scratching your head at exactly what Bonaventure's talking about when he's using the word infinity. That needs to be teased out a bit. So Bonaventure, unlike Scotus, doesn't really go through the structural moments of God's knowledge. Scotus very clearly says the first object of God's knowledge is the divine essence itself, which he says is intrinsically infinite. And infinite for Scotus just simply means maximal, unexceedable, logically unexceedable. But then he distinguishes between this first moment to a secondary moment. The moment is not chronological, but logical or structural. So if God knows in the first moment of his knowledge, his own essence as infinite, he would say then, Scotus, that this is the primary object of God's knowledge, is his own being. And then he would say that by virtue of God's infinity and his infinite knowledge, he knows an infinite number of possible things, or infinite number of ideas, including possibles, actuals, futurables, all of these different modes in which the ideas can be manifested. And these Scotus calls secondary objects of the divine being. And so in this sense, you can see how Scotus is arguing in two different ways. First of all, he's noting the point that the divine essence itself is conceived of as intrinsically, modally maximal or infinite. And Scotus will call this an intensive infinity. It's defining or speaking of the divine essence in itself, in its own mode of existence. And then he will say, by dint of this absolute infinite ontological perfection of infinity, then he knows all possible knowable ideas. These are just simply terms of God's knowledge. But the terms themselves, Scotus admits, are distinct. They're not really distinct from each other, and they're not really distinct from the divine essence, but they're distinct formally from each other, meaning as ideas, they're irreducible, right? You can't just simply say the idea of intellect is the same as the idea of will, the idea of a cat is the same as the idea of a dog. They're irreducibly different in some way, and this is what Scotus calls the formal distinction. So where you're moving from a kind of unified notion of maximal intensity to a notion of, within that intention, a kind of notion of exploding outward, yet being contained within that maximal and infinite unity of the divine essence, a whole extension of ideas. You can kind of imagine them extending for a potentially infinite space or length. And Scotus simply calls this extensive infinity. Okay, so he distinguishes on the one hand then between the primary object of God's knowledge and secondary objects, the primary being his own essence, secondary being those items of knowledge that are produced because of his own infinite knowledge. And then secondly, he distinguishes between intensive infinity and extensive infinity. But my point is he clearly maps out the stages in his reconstruction, for lack of a better word, of divine knowledge, the infinity of divine knowledge. It's rooted in the infinity of the divine essence, but the infinity of the divine essence is different in mode from the infinity of the divine knowledge, or the divine ideas. One is intensive, the other is extensive. Now, Bonaventure seems to be doing similar things, but he never explicitly spells it out. And so you're always having to work at points with Bonaventure, because he either assumes you know what he's doing, or perhaps he doesn't fully realize what he's doing, and he's really breaking new ground. And so this is something to always be noted when trying to understand what Bonaventure's doing, is that he doesn't divide up these moments that will become clear and distinct with Scotus a generation later. So moving on, after that caveat, any questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
When talking about the infinite knowledge of he refers to Gus and how he proves that in a way with just infinity of finite numbers. So maybe this could be clarified if I had a better background in philosophy, but couldn't we say also that man has infinite knowledge then, since we could also distinguish and understand an infinite amount of finite numbers? Just as he says God can.
That's a good question. And I wish I had all the text memorized here, because he does speak to that, at least implicitly. But I would say the distinction to be made here is the notion of God as pure act, having a knowledge of comprehension of an actual infinity, whereas creatures, because they're spiritual and intellective, there's always more that can be known. You can always count to a higher number, and thus you have a notion of infinity. You can always add an item of knowledge to your existing knowledge. So there's a potential infinity there. And the distinction would be then that a potential infinity implies incompletion and complexity, because your knowledge, by definition, would depend on its being informed from a source outside of yourself to augment or add to that potential infinity. But this can go on forever. And obviously a potential infinity is incomplete, because there's always, if there are an infinite number, an infinite series of numbers to know, or an infinity of numbers in a series that can be known, you can always count to a higher number, and thus in some way arrive at some new bit of concrete knowledge. What Bonaventure's saying is, yes, it is like that. Augustine's proof is right, but the difference between a created intellect and a divine intellect is that God knows all of this in a simple act of infinite comprehension, such that he doesn't have to count. Somehow he already traverses, if that's possible, if that's even conceivable, the infinite series of numbers, or he already traverses, every idea that he might have of a possible creature. So you have a cat and a lat and a horse and a rorse. You can go on. He already knows all of these things as possible with a simple act of infinite comprehension. Whereas we as creatures, yes, we could arrive and come to new states of knowledge and constantly be added to in terms of our knowledge, but we would never actually be at this state of comprehension of the infinity of possibilities. And so that's the difference. And so you can say infinite, in one sense, is a lack of an end or a boundary.
Indefinite.
But if you look, what's that?
Indefinite.
Alex?
Indefinite.
Indefinite. But Bonaventure, as we will see in question 3 of the De Mysterio Trinitatis, he subdistinguishes multiple modes of infinity, and he speaks of infinity in 2 senses, basically. An infinity of material quantity, and an infinity of a spiritual quantity. And now here again, he's going to be following Augustine. But with respect to a material quantity, an infinity always implies incompleteness or imperfection in some mode, because it's material. It pertains to a material order. But an infinity of a spiritual quantity for Bonaventure simply means, in modern logical, especially analytic philosophical terms, it simply means maximal, logically unsurpassable, actus purus. It simply is fully itself from all eternity. And so in that sense, infinity means something just absolutely perfectly realized. And so we can see it in terms of a positive perfection, even though it's used in a privative form of language, infinite, not finite, lacking an end. or indefinite, as Dr. Plato said. But really what it's trying to get to in asserting an infinity of spiritual quantity or power, he's trying to say something positive. No, it fully is what it is. And that's the same kind of reasoning that Scotus will use. But, it's to be conceded that the language limps here. But I think we can get to an intimation of what's going on just simply by imagining an infinite series of numbers. We can kind of, even though we can't count that, we can kind of imagine what an infinity is, even if we, in terms of our knowledge and our process, can always add to it. Or we can just imagine a being that doesn't have to add to it, that he has it all, somehow, essentially. This extensive infinity is finite to this being because of what this being is, and because of these lesser infinities of ideas or possibles already derive from this unimaginable super maximal infinity of the divine being. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but it's a good question.
No, that does. Thank you very much.
Okay, moving on. Question, the same page, 78. One thing to note, Bonaventure clearly asserts with respect to God's intelligence is that it's intrinsic. And this is important because God is solely the cause of his own knowledge. God is not informed by anything outside of himself. His knowledge is derived solely from his own perfection because he's simple and he's infinitely perfect. And so if his intelligence is intrinsic, this means, according to Bonaventure, that according to mode, it's abstracted from all causes, all secondary or created causes. According to object, and this gets back to the light of the divine truth, which is simply God's essence as expressing as a light all truth, which includes the truth of his own being and perfection, and the truth of all possibles, etc., 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 anything knowable. And in terms of object, it's simply the divine truth itself, the transcendental truth in its ultimate reality, its ultimate reduction. And here Bonaventure is following closely St. Augustine and St. Anselm in terms of the notion of truth. They're big into that. And then finally, in terms of principle, it's through the eternal reasons, or the rationes aeternae. Well, now we're looking at exemplar, in that mode of knowledge, exemplar, the ratio cognoscendi as exemplar. And so with respect to this notion of connotation then, because God's act of knowledge is intrinsic and it flows from his own being as the light expressing divine truth, and it terminates in his knowledge of his own intensive being, his own intensive infinite being, as well as it extends throughout everything that is possible to know. So thus all possible beings he also knows, is that with respect to connotation, the connotation isn't limited by any created being, any created order. In fact, these things connote eternally. And connote just simply has to do with the objective possibility that these possibilities that God knows be realized. They're not bound up into a kind of relation or even a quasi-relation of dependency upon the created order and the actual number of existences outside of God. So that's an important thing to know, because the act is intrinsic and it terminates within God. God knows an infinity of things, an actual infinity of things, so argues Bonaventure, entirely through himself, prescinding from every cause, having for its object the divine truth itself, and known through the eternal ideas that eternally emanate or are quasi, I don't want to say generated, but in a sense principiated because of God's infinite being as truth. There's a kind of containment. If you imagine an arrangement, kind of a Porphyrian tree arrangement, you can imagine God's essence up here at the top, and then you can imagine God's essence as light or expressive underneath that. That's a mode of conceiving of God's essence as light. Light is diffusive. It goes out in rays, but the light at its source is simple. But then the light at its source is expressive then in terms of knowledge, in terms of knowable things. underneath light can be placed truth, right? God as truth. They're all absolute perfections of the divine being and ways of speaking metaphorically, in a certain sense, about God's infinite perfection, but they're ways of cashing out or specifying what we're saying about his knowledge or how he knows things. So it's by virtue of his essence, as light, as truth, and then truth being expressed in all these different possibilities that he knows things. So God knows things by virtue of his own essence as truth. And truth underneath contains all possible truths underneath that in terms of a Porphyrian arrangement or a pyramid type of arrangement. Any questions, observations? So I think.
How does this relate to artifacts?
How does it relate to artifacts? Well, if you go back to our discussion earlier about God's knowledge through the exemplar, the artifact has to do with it's one of those species or modes by which one can consider the exemplary ideas, or the divine exemplar as truth being expressed in an exemplary manner. Well, the art has to do with the fact that anything that God wills to create will be by virtue of a divine exemplary idea. And if that idea is God chooses in the mystery of his will to realize that or to actualize that in an existence outside of himself, that will then be attached to his will. So the art, the divine art, simply is a way of speaking of the divine idea as the ratio cognoscendi, the reason why that God knows what he will create. And so art has a mutual entanglement, so to speak, with the divine idea as an exemplary idea, but also the divine idea as will be realized by virtue of the divine will choosing to create that idea. And so in this sense then, because every divine idea is just simply natural to God, yet everything outside of himself is not necessary or natural to God, all of these divine ideas serve as principles for creating, and thus when created serve as the divine art by which God brings something practical to fruition or to existence outside of himself. And so in this respect, every created substance, even a natural substance, is in relation to the divine being an artifact of God's free creativity. And so that's how this notion of art is used. It has a connotation and association with God's free will to create something.
I guess particularly like a human artifact in the sense of, well, to phrase the discussion how it occurred, is there an exemplary idea of a Big Mac?
Yeah, there certainly is. Because there's not just an exemplary idea of a Big Mac for Bonaventure. There's an exemplary idea of every Big Mac you may have ever eaten for Bonaventure. God knows a lot of stuff.
Okay, so the exemplary idea is...
So, by means of this, obviously God would have knowledge of simple intelligence, right? The possibility of Big Mac-ness in every Big Mac. The 500 million Big Macs that have been eaten. I'm probably more than that. But he would also then, through his knowledge of simple intelligence, understand that the condition for the possibility of a Big Mac is predicated on the condition of cows, is predicated on the condition of secondary agents who are creative who want to make Big Macs. And so by that extent, of course, God doesn't directly will to create a Big Mac because Big Macs are artifacts of human ingenuity, as human beings are artifacts in a sense of divine ingenuity. But the principle, if you want to say, yes, God has an exemplary idea of a Big Mac, sure, he does because he knows all things. And Big Macs are knowable, and this Big Mac is knowable and distinct from that Big Mac. So God must have an exemplary idea of those two Big Macs and Big Mac-ness. But the analogy runs more closely along it, and Bonaventure uses the notion of building a house. a man has a notion of a house, and this is very close to Aristotle. A man has a notion of a house internal prior to his artfully bringing this house to completion through material means and through labor. Well, God doesn't have to labor, but in a similar way, God has a notion of Fra Charles before he wills to bring into actual existence Fra Charles and preserve Fra Charles and bring Fra Charles to his the term of his life. And so in that sense, because God has this simple knowledge, which is just simply natural to God, because intellect is a natural power, then if God wants to, or somehow chooses, or wills rather, to bring Fra Charles into actual existence, this bringing Fra Charles into actual existence will be by virtue of the divine idea. And once that divine idea is willed to come into existence, then it would be the divine art, bringing this divine idea into existence, or rather bringing Fra Charles into his own existence by means of the blueprints or coding or programming or the eternal exemplary idea of Fra Charles himself. And so in that way, man's knowledge is analogous because man has to have some idea beforehand of what he's going to do in order to bring about or realize any kind of idea that he has. So there's both the blueprints, the idea, and then there's the will and the means to bring it about. Well, clearly, with God, he doesn't have to have means, even though with Fra Charles he did use means, but in order to create ex nihilo, he didn't. He just had the divine ideas and his will to bring about these primordial realities solely by the infinite power of his will. But yes, the artifact notion is simply the realization that God is absolutely free to create what he created. According, however, to an infinite number of divine ideas, X number of which he selected to actually bring into existence through the free determination and good pleasure of his will. Let's. You know what? We're running. I'm running too long. Any questions or observations?
I
Go ahead.
just wanted to start making that one. I wanted to say it earlier when you were talking about the perfection of God's infinite knowledge. Another way you could put it is to say that God knows. This is just to stress the perfection with it, because you stress that quite a bit in talking about God's knowledge and how it's, it's a perfect knowledge of all things. You could say God knows things, all possible things, in fact. Whereas we have, if we're finite, with a finite, we can know things, say infinite, insofar as it's just a potentiality, possibility. Would that be a
Yeah, I think yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. God knows all possible things as possible, in fact. Yes, these items as possible, he knows. But he knows them simply as possible in terms of his knowledge of simple intelligence. And, we can't do that. We have to start from some contingent fact and work backwards to, in a sense, even work backwards to the possibility, because certainly we can't infer from the possibility to a fact, but we can clearly infer from the fact to the possibility. But in that sense, we're already all dependent de facto on God's creative will and these things that we know that exist in reality, not just merely in possibility. Okay, move on. Let's go to page 79. And this will be important for the questions that follow. Bonaventure distinguishes in his response to the first objection between two kinds of knowledge in terms of their cause. He specifies the first is a kind of knowledge that causes things, and another is a kind of knowledge that is caused by things. And this is an important distinction for Bonaventure because he wants to affirm that God has ideas of things that are distinct in some way, yet are not caused by the things themselves. Somehow he wants to say that the divine ideas serve as causes, exemplary causes of the things that are known. And so by this, he's avoiding in his own mind and giving an explanation for how God has distinct ideas of an infinite number of possibilities and all actual and future and final realities and states of affairs, without those states of affairs informing his own knowledge. So he's wanting to avoid saying God's knowledge is incomplete somehow, God's knowledge is complex somehow, God's knowledge is imperfect somehow, independent somehow. Whereas our knowledge, on the other hand, our knowledge is caused by things. We know one another and that we're speaking to one another because of the fact that we really are speaking. You're speaking to me. Well, I'm speaking to you, really. And you know this because I keep talking. But your knowledge of this doesn't cause my speaking in any sense. Well, Bonaventure says in some relevant sense, God's knowledge is a cause of things. So that's the first important distinction he makes, because then when he speaks about exemplary ideas in terms of imitation and simple independency in the next question, well, this is predicated upon this. Another important thing to note is his objection, his response to the second objection. In this objection, he distinguishes, at least implicitly, between absolute and relative infinities. And you know what he's actually saying is that somehow the implication is that even God's knowledge of infinite possibilities, which Bonaventure himself does speak of in terms of an extensive infinity. God's knowledge extends over an infinite number of truths, because there are an infinite number of possibilities that are known by him. He wants to say that this infinity is somehow relative to an absolute infinity, and that absolute infinity would be his own essence or being. Somehow his essence or being, by dint of its infinite perfection, allows for a simple, comprehensive understanding or vision of all possible things. And so that's an important distinction that will come to play later on with Scotus. Absolute relative infinities and various modes of infinity, such as intensive and extensive, that sort of thing. Another point that is interesting is in his response to the fourth objection. It says, I'll just read it. To the objection that whatever God knows is known distinctly, it must be said that the conclusion is false, inasmuch as it affirms that whatever God knows distinctly is therefore numbered. And so this gets to the point of the earlier question about a series of numbers. In actual infinity, it cannot be ordered, and Bonaventure will affirm this later on by saying that the ideas themselves imply no mutual relation to one another and no order of dependency or generation from one another, but rather they're just a kind of big massive of ideas that are infinite, but in terms of their infinity, they're not ordered between one another, and they're not numbered because there's no beginning to the ideas. They just all kind of sit there together. And so, how do you know distinctly if they're not numbered? Well, Bonaventure just simply responds, to know distinctly means more than to designate by number. Or another response to the objection would be to say that whatever God knows distinctly is designated with a number that is either finite or infinite. But then this would not follow that God measures, because measure implies something merely finite. And I think the point is simply Bonaventure saying that God has an ineffable vision of every possibility in its actuality as possible that is ultimately inexplicable. We can kind of imagine it, but we can't in any way comprehend it. I guess in a sense, to comprehend the idea of divine infinity would imply a comprehension of a divine infinity itself, if we fully comprehended it, rather than just apprehend or kind of gesture toward it with analogies. Responding to the earlier question about created knowledge and uncreated knowledge with respect to infinity, you might look at questions or the responses to objections 7 through 10, because this carries out a discussion between actual and potential infinity and how those distinctions are resolved. I won't go through those. If there are any questions about question 1 so far. Okay, Just keep in mind then that Bonaventure affirms that God knows an actual number of possibilities, an actual infinite number of possibilities. Somehow the infinity is finite to God, and I think this is best explained through the distinction between intensive infinity and extensive infinity, and the quasi, I say, not causal, but quasi-dependency in terms of an account of the divine ideas themselves, or God's knowledge, the quasi-dependency of these ideas on the infinity of the divine essence itself in terms of a structural or logical order of moments. So that's, first of all, the assertion that God has an actual knowledge of an infinite number of possibilities. Second, that this intelligence is absolutely intrinsic to God. And then third, there are two kinds of knowledge: a knowledge that causes in some way, and a knowledge that is caused by something else. And of course, we attribute the first kind to God and the second kind to a creature. Moving on then to question 2. Let's see here.
Yeah, I think so.
This is in this question, and I don't actually know if we'll have enough time to get through it, but this is an important question to get an understanding of what Bonaventure means by his two modes of likeness, and then his understanding of analogy, which will then help us understand as we move forward into discussions of Scotus and his understanding of univocity and analogy. So the second question asks simply, does God know all things by means of the things' likenesses or similitudes, or by means of their proper essence? Now, if we already know from the first question that God's knowledge is entirely intrinsic and is caused by nothing else, is in a mode that abstracts from all secondary causes, we'll have to say then that God knows all things by means of their likenesses or similitudes, by means of their eternal exemplars, rather than through their essences, because knowledge through an essence implies that the essence itself is informing or causing that knowledge, such as when we arrive at knowledge of the essence of a cat, well, we have to actually see a cat, or be told about a cat, or read about a cat, and then abstract certain aspects or characteristics from a cat, and then form a universal concept about the cat. Well, with God, that doesn't happen, because that would, again, impugn divine simplicity and divine infinity. So then Bonaventure, in conclusion, then, just simply says in his response that, now this is an editorial response that I'll read, but it captures what he will conclude. Top of page 89. God knows creatures by means of eternal reasons, which are the exemplary likenesses of creatures. They are most perfectly representative and expressive, and they are essentially identical to the divine mystery itself. So thus, somehow, God's knowledge as the ratio cognoscendi that we spoke of earlier must be explained, or must somehow explain how God knows things outside of himself, and things in terms of their ideas, pure ideas, that are distinct notionally, or according to reason, or by their ratio, distinct from the divine essence itself. Somehow this account has to explain how that's possible. So in the first place, Bonaventure quotes Dionysius. And this is an interesting quotation, because you find the same quotation in St. Maximus the Confessor, when he's giving his account of the Logos and the Logoi. And let's see, that comes in, I have it here, that comes in St. Maximus the Confessor's Ambiguum number 7, where he gives his own account, which is entirely Greek and obviously independent of Bonaventure, but making essentially the same point and using the passage in the same way. You know, just something to keep in mind about the commonality in terms of deep metaphysical and theological and epistemic structures and systems between the Franciscan school and the better tradition, or the more prominent tradition of the Greeks, namely, in this case, Pseudo-Dionysius, St. Maximus, and St. John of Damascus. And so, first of all, he begins by affirming that Dionysius and Augustine have both written in many places that God knows creatures by means of eternal reasons. And then he goes to quote the Dionysius. And another note that should be mentioned here is that so far as I know, and I could easily be proven wrong, and I haven't done a careful study of this, but I don't think this quote of Dionysius shows up in the sentence commentary in the same sense or usage at the very least. So in a sense, Bonaventure here is making a clarification based upon his quotation of Dionysius that both clarifies his earlier teaching about the divine ideas, or writing about the divine ideas in the sentence commentary, but also, perhaps as we will see, may anticipate an objection that comes later from Duns Scotus about the ideas. So Dionysius writes, "We say that the exemplars of existing beings pre-exist in God in a singular way as substantial reasons, which theology calls predefinitions. They are the good and divine acts of the will, which determine and create existing beings. And it is in accordance with these that the supersubstantial existence predefines and produces all things." Important to note here is that in this quotation, Bonaventure is using Dionysius to affirm, one, God knows all things, but specifically created things by the good acts, or the good acts of his will. So thus there's this implicit notion that God knows created things by virtue not just of bare intelligence or just mere abstract knowledge of possibles, but he knows existing things and future things and reprobation and election through his will or along with his will. God doesn't know these created entities outside of himself apart from knowing his will and what his will determined to do. Now, this is an important distinction because later on Duns Scotus will criticize Bonaventure, but remember, Scotus did not have these disputed questions so far as we know. And if I'm actually factually correct, that Bonaventure doesn't cite this passage of Dionysius in his sentence commentaries in the same context, you can understand why Scotus will have this objection, but you can also understand how Bonaventure perhaps softens the objection that Scotus will bring, or maybe even resolves or responds adequately to the objection that Scotus will bring. So the point here is that Scotus criticizes Bonaventure and says, and other people who agree with him, and he says, God doesn't know things outside of himself, things that he creates, or things that will be future contingents through the divine ideas. And this is simply because ideas refer purely to intellectual objects of intellection. And an idea in this context as an object of intellection is simply a natural mode of operation and a term of a natural mode of operation. But obviously, created things cannot just simply be by virtue of natural operation. Therefore, God knows things outside of himself, not through ideas, but through his will. And so when Bonaventure teaches in the sentence commentaries that God knows future contingents, for example, through the divine ideas, Scotus will object and say, well, the divine ideas don't give you future contingents because they're just the terms of a natural operation of God's infinite active intellection and thus infinite understanding. And so if this is true, well, then there's no freedom in creation. And if there's no freedom in creation, there's no creation as such. And so Scotus says, God knows future contingents and existing things as the terms of his creative and dispositive will. He knows them through knowing the items of his will, or the terms of his will. Well, we can see what Bonaventure is doing here is he's actually subdividing the notion of ideas into a notion that refers to simple intelligence. God just knows all possibles. And that's the term of a natural act. but he also knows ideas of what he creates and what he will do and the final end of all things. He has ideas of these, but these ideas are essentially dependent also upon his will, acting to create, acting to act providentially, to will future states of affairs, to will the final state of all things. So what Bonaventure has done here is he's at least begun to give a response to the objection that Scotus will raise, and I think rightly so, but he doesn't necessarily, Scotus seems to have not been aware that Bonaventure used Dionysius to make this distinction in these disputed questions. And so, there may be more de facto continuity on this point between Bonaventure and Scotus than Scotus himself would have thought. Any questions at this point? Oh, okay. A second point then is that Bonaventure wants to clearly avoid the implication that the eternal ideas or the divine ideas or the eternal art or the rationes aeternae are in any sense equivalent to the true essences or quiddities of created things. And so what he's doing here is, again, he's preserving and developing his statement from the previous question that God's intelligence is an entirely intrinsic activity of God because he's infinitely perfect, he's simple, and he's pure act. So thus God's intelligence cannot in any sense be in composition, or his ideas cannot in any sense be in composition with substances or accidents that exist outside of the divine being. Rather, there's a relation of dependency of the created thing upon the divinity, specifically the divinity's will act to create. But in no way do the divine ideas become parts or forms of these created essences. And so then Bonaventure will distinguish then three ways in which essences or forms can be said to exist. He will say essences or forms or ideas or exemplars can exist either in the things themselves, like the cat. The cat has the form of Katniss, and that's a concrete particular form because it entered into a concrete subsistence through composition of matter and form. Or it can exist in the mind of the created knower as a universal abstract idea, or it can exist in the divine art. That's exactly the formulation that Bonaventure uses, in the divine art. So Bonaventure is already speaking of a divine idea in terms of God's creative activity and goodwill. So this is this notion of somehow these essences are exclusive to the divine art, but yet they pertain and serve as guiding principles or blueprints for those things that terminate outside of God via his creative will. Any questions, observations? Is this making sense in light of what you read of the text?
Yeah.
All right. I don't see anyone, so I can't tell if you're asleep or not.
No, we're very much awake.
I turned my screen off because I was eating, and I didn't think you wanted to see me munching nuts.
Well, I'd rather see a bunch of nuts than see munching nuts, and so I wish your cameras would work because all you see is one nut.
I'm up there now too. You're not alone, Jared.
I feel better. Okay, moving on to page 90. And this is an important thing because Bonaventure distinguishes between two modes of likeness, and this is a brilliant insight or a blazing insight of Bonaventure. This distinction of likeness or similitude. And again, the problem with Bonaventure is you've just got to read him again and again and again because he uses all these synonyms. He will drive you crazy with synonyms. He'll use the word similitude, idea, ratio, cognoscendi in a certain context. What else? He'll just use all these terms, so you have to be very careful to see how they map onto one another, and how he's using them in a given context. So in this sense, then, he calls the eternal ideas, he speaks of the eternal ideas in terms of the forms, or exemplary forms. Remember, going back to our breakdown of knowledge, exemplar can be spoken of, according to Bonaventure, in terms of idea, word, art, or ratio. So by saying the idea is an exemplary form, he's just proving that usage. So an idea. All right. Is there a question? Okay. These exemplary forms, then, Bonaventure speaks of as representative likenesses or similitudes of created things. So in some sense, then, Bonaventure's really biting the bullet here. He's saying that God, in some sense, through these representative likenesses, is like a creature. So, we always want to say that creatures imitate God in a finite way. Well, actually, God is in some way like a creature through these representative likenesses. God has these representative likenesses, and insofar as these representative likenesses, according to Bonaventure, are identical with the divine truth or the divine uber exemplar, and thus the divine essence, to that extent, God is like a creature. Okay? So God, in knowing himself in this exemplary likeness, is knowing himself as being like a creature. And thus these representative likenesses that follow from or flow from or are principiated by divine truth itself as light, the light of divine truth shining forth even within God himself, supplying God with this knowledge of an infinite number of knowable items. These ideas are then, for Bonaventure, principles of knowledge. They're principles. These ratio cognoscendi. They're the reasons of knowing something. So in a sense, these likenesses serve as principles of divine knowledge, intrinsic to the divine essence itself. And for Bonaventure, then, knowledge itself must function then as both an expression in God, as an expression of something. So these representatives, these representations or representative likenesses of created beings express something, namely the truth of the finite, knowable, possible, or actual item, the finite object of God's knowledge, intrinsic to himself, but also an assimilation between the subject and object known. Well, of course, there can be no assimilation between God and creature in an ontological sense because they're of infinitely distinct natures. So he speaks of an assimilation simply in terms of, or more helpfully in terms of, an assimilation just simply between God as the knowing subject and the object of his knowledge via or in and through the divine idea or as a divine idea. And so he's able to take a metaphor or an analogy based upon created knowledge, because created knowledge is an assimilation between the object and the person knowing through an expression, right? We express things in our mind internally. We form a concept in order to know, in order to be assimilated to the thing. Well, in God, it's just the reverse. God expresses a truth, and thereby the truth, or thereby there's assimilation by virtue of his expression and the real identity of that truth to its own essence. So God speaks a word or expresses these likenesses because he knows, and we form concepts or speak words interiorly to ourselves in order to know. So with God, the order of knowing, or the causal order of knowing, is simply reversed. And in this sense, then, as expressing likenesses or representative likenesses, Bonaventure can say that these are causes of knowledge. These are the causes of divine knowledge, as in terms of his own account. So God simply knows things by dint of his infinite perfection, but his infinite perfection pertains to his perfect intellect, and his perfect intellect knows everything that is expressed by the light of divine truth, which knows and expresses all possibles and all actuals and all futures and final things by dint of its own, just simply because God's knowledge is perfect. So, Bonaventure will conclude on page 90 then, that God knows created things through their exemplary likenesses or similitudes or ideas. Now, is this order that Bonaventure is working with and articulating clear? Because in fact, this is quite similar to what Scotus will do in a more elaborate and careful presentation. But Bonaventure here is really laying the groundwork for Scotus's later understanding of divine knowledge, and divine knowledge as possible or explainable in terms of divine perfection itself, infinite perfection. Any question? Okay. Now we get to go ahead. What?
This might not be a very good question, but anyways, does Bonaventure or Scotus maybe go into particulars as how the creature is like God in the sense, like you could say, like because of its like in the De Reductione, he talks about the image or the similitude, image, and offspring. It seemed to me that was a kind of comparison to the Trinity, i.e., the Father and the Word, and then the Holy Spirit is the relationship between the two. Does he talk about that being the kind of the quintessential way we see God in creatures, or does that make sense?
I'm not sure I exactly followed it. I felt like there was something important in there, but I couldn't quite get the nub of your question. I'm sorry.
That's right. It's not your fault. It's mine. Does either Bonaventure or Scotus show, like in a particular way, how God is like a creature?
Bonaventure and Scotus both will argue, and especially Bonaventure in this text will argue that God is like a creature insofar as God as light and as truth expresses all possible knowable items. And Bonaventure here seems to be just simply asserting that the possibility of some finite essence is in a relation of logical dependency upon the divine being, but the possibility as such, even though it derives from God's intensive infinity, just simply what God is, the possibility is just simply a statement that it's simply possible. It's not as though God creates or causes their possibility. Just his reality as divine truth, or the light of divine truth. He expresses all truths, and thus he expresses all possible things. He doesn't create them. In this sense, he doesn't cause them. It's just simply the it's kind of like the relationship between your mind and your skin. Your mind doesn't cause skin to grow. It just, or your nature. You don't cause your nature to do this. It's just what your nature does. It provides a covering for your body. There's no choice or volition or creative causal act. It just is what your nature does. Now you can say reductively, it's in virtue of your form as a human nature that the body has skin. But it's not as though it's an efficient kind of causality. And in that sense, Bonaventure just simply says God's truth, or the expression of infinite truth, is just simply because of what God is. God doesn't will to do it. He doesn't create it. It just is what God is, right? So he knows all possibles. And so thus, Bonaventure will say God is like a creature insofar as each one of these possible ideas mirror God in their own finitude, structural, essential finitude, because none of these ideas, the idea of a cat or a dog or a Big Mac, none of those imply infinity, but they imply certain things that are dependent upon an infinitely perfect being in some way. And so if they're realized, well, then they will manifest, the aspects of order, of number, of weight, of beauty, of exemplary and final causality. So in that sense, God is like a creature insofar as each of these truths expressed by divine truth mirror some aspect in a limited way, or network of aspects in a limited way, of God's own infinite perfection. Just really, it's being itself, that which is in flight of nothing. They mirror being. It's a possible existence than actual existence. And so in that sense, Bonaventure will say, yes, God is like a creature in these ways, just in terms of the divine idea. But clearly, God is like a creature in other ways with respect to the actual existing vestige, image, and similitude. And, clearly with the image, God is like a creature insofar as God has memory, intellect, and will, and this is mirrored in the creature, or at least in the divine idea of the creature, and brought to reality in the really existing creature. And more could be said. Let's see. We have about five minutes. Any questions? I don't think we're going to get through question 2 today.
Jared, I have a question.
Yes.
When you're talking about the expressive word, or the speaking of the word like God, or the ideal, how does Jesus play into that in this terminology with us understanding?
Yeah, okay. Well, in the first place, you can say that the intellect, and thus infinite or perfect knowledge, is simply a natural perfection of the divine essence, okay? And so this is something predicable of the divine essence without considering the divine essence as terminating in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So thus we can say then, okay, that the Father, in his primordial fatherhood, already has infinite knowledge and infinite love, because it's an essential perfection, or at least a will to love his own perfection in infinite, okay? So in this sense, perfect knowledge and perfect love is just part of the divine. It's not part of it. They're qualities or perfections of the divine essence. Then with respect to Jesus, scholastic theologians distinguish them. They distinguish the act, or the essential act of knowledge, which is a natural act of knowledge and willing, which the Father has independently of the Son. They distinguish that from the act of the Father to speak a word, which is the Father acting personally, terminating in the communication of the divine being to a second term via the mode of the intellect. But he's not saying that the intellect itself of the Father is somehow realized through the speaking of the word, because that would make the Father dependent upon the Son in order for the Father to have a perfect act of intellection. What he's saying is that you can distinguish then apart from, or speak apart from, the essential perfection of the Father's intellect and will. You can distinguish that from his act of generating, which is also through will. But this is a mode of communication that has terms of origin and terms of fulfillment or arrival. And so Jesus then would be the Word of the Father. This is the Father's perfect expression of himself via intellect that terminates in the full communication of the divine being. And this is why this full communication via intellect is why he's called the Word, and why we speak of him as being communicated via will. But the point is here then is that the Word is distinct from the Father as terminating from the Father's act of generation. But both the Word and the Father then share essentially perfect intellection and volition, because they're the same being. And so with respect to the divine ideas then, you have the communication eternally of the perfection of the divine nature to the Word, to the Son, via intellection. And thus, because it's via intellection, we use the term word, because a word it speaks of logos, or reason. Okay? And so thus we can say the Word then contains by nature all of the divine truth that God knows. But clearly the Word as Word doesn't cause the Father's knowledge. Rather, the Word as Word, meaning as a person, is simply the term that we give of the second person of the Trinity, because the act of communication of the divine being is via intellect. And then the act of communication of the divine being to the Spirit is via love. And so we call that spirit or nexus or bond. But we don't say that the Word is essentially the knowledge of the Father. No. That doesn't make sense, because then the Father would be in dependency again upon the Word, and you would have the persons and the essence all mixed up, and none of them would be perfect, and none of them would be perfect God. Rather, God would be a composite of these three persons, and then so that's important to distinguish. And then with respect to Jesus Christ as the incarnate Word, what's being said there is, on the one hand, by virtue of being the second person of the Trinity, he has a divine nature, or the divine nature, one divine nature. And that's by dint of his personhood. But by dint of the same personhood assuming a created human nature, he also has a created nature. He's not a creature. He's a divine person, so he can't be a creature. Yet he has a created nature, a divine nature, hypostatically united in one person. And so when we speak of Christ as the exemplar, the created Christ as the exemplar, we're not saying that he is the infinity of divine knowledge or wisdom in terms of nature. Rather, we say that Christ as being the middle person of the Trinity and being the mediator in his dual natures between God and man, and then being the mediatory nature in creation as such between pure spirits and pure material things, is in some way an exemplary perfection in terms of mediation and recapitulation and headship of all created things. And so in his humanity, he's an exemplar, but he's not the infinite knowledge, nor is he the efficient cause in his humanity of all it is. But because his humanity is hypostatically united to the Word, and the Word then is the middle person of the Trinity, and the Word best reveals God's infinite knowledge, then we can say that, like with St. John in the first chapter of John, the prologue, all things were created by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. We can speak with Paul in Colossians 1:16 through 18. All things. He's the firstborn from the dead, but he's also the firstborn of all creation, and through him all things were created, whether principalities, dominions, etc. And so you've got to keep that. It's in virtue of the one person of the Word that all of these things can be predicated by what they call the communicatio idiomatum, the communication of idioms to the one person, while distinguishing between how the divine nature or the human nature functions with respect to this one predication. So we can say in some sense that God died, but we can't say God died in his person or in his nature, but we can say that God died in his human nature. You see, so you can predicate a lot of things of the person of Christ as a whole, but you have to keep in mind the distinction between, well, by virtue of what is he doing this? His human nature, or by virtue of what are we predicating this of Christ? His human nature, divine nature, or both, in that sense. I don't know if that maybe just muddied the waters.
It's a lot to handle.
Yeah, it's a lot to say.
A lot to say, but necessary.
Well, let's just, you know what, if we have about 8 more minutes, can we just press on? Because there's one distinction that I think is important, and this is the pivotal distinction that Bonaventure makes in this question, but he never explains. Do we have time for this? Alex, I don't know if you've got to go.
No, I'm okay.
Okay, sorry to do this to you. Okay, first of all, Bonaventure distinguishes between 2 modes of representation. And representation here for Bonaventure is analogy, okay? And Bonaventure is wedded to a form of analogy that doesn't allow for explicitly admitting that he's predicating univocally. And there are reasons why he doesn't want to predicate or say there is univocal predication between creatures and God. And so the two modes of analogy or representation that he distinguishes is an analogy of proportion. Two things compared to a third, right? Or two things participating in a third nature external to both of them, or independent as such from both of them. You know, like Alex and his cat participating in the genus. Forgive me, I'm messing up my taxonomy, but I wanted to compare Alex to a cat, but I just messed up my whole comparison. Why don't I say I was going to say to the genus animal, right? Two things relate, but that's not exactly the same nature. So you've got to say two dogs participating in the species of dogness of a dog, right? And so Bonaventure says this is one kind of analogy, and of course this is impossible between a creature, even an image of God, and God, because, well, there is no third thing between God and creature, right? There's no third thing that they both participate in. So this already gets to the point of, you know, there's no genus of being under which there's a God species and a creature's genus with a bunch of species subdivided underneath. So he said there's a relation or a resemblance of proportionality, and this can be two things to one in this instance. But he also then divides. He says there's proportion, and then there's proportionality. And proportionality, Bonaventure discusses other places. Unlike two things in one, you know, two things participating in a common nature, which is impossible again. There also is two things to two things. So you could say, as a teacher is to a class, so is the captain to a ship. You can see the relation of proportionality. The teacher guides and directs his class. The captain guides and directs his ship, right? And so this is a kind of analogy that you can predicate of a creature and of God. But the problem is, again, is you have a hard time explaining, well, what's the common note? Unless there's just some sort of common relation or recognition of order or resemblance of order. And this is where we get to simple resemblance. Now, this is another species of analogy, but it's a species of analogy that shaves so close to univocity, but Bonaventure just can't go there explicitly, that as, who was it? I just read this. Anyway, I forget where I read it, but some scholar said recently that Bonaventure never explains this theory of resemblance, simple likeness. There's a resemblance of simple likeness. A creature is like to God, and God is like to creature in terms of a simple resemblance. Wisdom and wisdom, you see, something like this. A creative idea, an exemplary idea, and the created things. Bonaventure just asserts a simple resemblance there. But he never develops the distinction, but he uses the distinction in order to motivate his explanation. There's a likeness of proportion, two things in a third, or there's a likeness of simple resemblance. One thing to one thing. One is simply like another. And the comparison is direct, but it becomes difficult to say that there's not some univocity conceptually in order to establish the one-to-one comparison between the divine idea of Jared and the me Jared out here. So he just says there's the idea of the simple resemblance. And he divides this then into two modes, into a likeness of imitation and a likeness of exemplarity. And the likeness of imitation is the creature's likeness of the creator, and the likeness of exemplarity is the creator's likeness to the creature. Now, you know, what he's doing here is quite fascinating, because many theologians would shy away from comparing again the creator to a creature. But Bonaventure is simply saying, by dint of the divine idea, there is a certain likeness of God to a creature. And this is the exemplary likeness. Next week, I think we should stop now, but you know, keep that distinction in mind and read that section again if you have a chance, and see if you can come up with, you know, an account of what Bonaventure is doing there. I think it's an absolutely true distinction, but he doesn't really ever explain how the distinction can work in terms of a metaphysics of analogy. because it's just simply a one-to-one likeness. It's hard to compare things one-to-one. Usually things are compared in terms of a third or in terms of a common concept. But Bonaventure wants to move away from univocity. And so I think we can pick up on this discussion of simple likeness of resemblance as distinct from analogy of proportion and proportionality next week, and then kind of unpack this and tease this out. Alex, go ahead.
Does he have this discussion in the Breviloquium or somewhere else besides just that one place?
No, yeah, let me think. I think his most extensive discussion is actually in the Disputed Questions. It's been a while since I've read those texts, but he may discuss it in somewhere around distinction 35 to 39 of the first book of the Sentences. I can look that up again. There probably is that discussion in there, but it doesn't have a prolonged account. And he doesn't really explain on the basis upon which the comparison is made. It's just likeness. It's just a likeness. But a likeness it sounds an awful lot like conceptual univocity in two modes. Infinite, finite. Right. Infinite insofar as it radically reduces to the divine essence and is instantiated in God and is identical with God. Finite insofar as the concept is ultimately predicated upon a being that has accidents, and is finite. But yet there's some nexus of likeness where the likeness just simply is the likeness. One thing is like another. And then he has two directions going. Imitative, vertical, and moving upward, and exemplary, vertical, moving downward. But anyway, I think we should wrap it up for today. I'm sorry that we didn't make as much progress in this text as I'd hoped, but I hope this was somewhat illuminating and becomes more illuminating when we finally get to question 4.
No pun intended.
So for next week, what are we doing for next week?
What we'll do is we're going to move through questions 2 and 3 really fast, and then settle on 4 hopefully for about 45 minutes, and then get through 5 and 6, because 5 and 6 are more of, I think we can move quickly through 5, 6, and 7, simply because all he's doing is we can draw implications based upon anthropology about the perfection of knowledge, but this is through grace and theology. And so we can make some points about the interconnection between faith and reason, philosophy, theology, knowledge, and grace without having to go into an in-depth discussion of created and uncreated wisdom, just simply because it doesn't properly cover philosophical topics. It's more particularly theological, having to do with providence and grace. And so I think we can finish up the Disputed Questions on the Knowledge of Christ next Friday. And then after that, we will move into the Disputed Questions on the Mystery of the Trinity. Hopefully move quickly through that, and then dispense with the itinerarium, and then we'll be into SCOTUS. So I think 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, we'll be in SCOTUS.
Do you have a scan of well, 2 questions. Do you have a scan of the knowledge of Disputed Questions on the Trinity?
I don't have a scan of that. I have hard copies of it.
I can make it.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
I can make one. I can scan a copy of the Disputed Questions on the Trinity.
Thanks, Alex. That'd be great.
I just replied to the email that I forget which friar sent it.
Friar Charles.
Oh,
right, Father Charles. And I sent a reply with Bonaventure's commentary on Ecclesiastes.
oh wow.
And
Very cool.
but the thing is that the student worker who copied it, they like every other page is like reversed. So you'll just have to as you read it, like put them the right way, which is really easy.
And then save it.
I didn't go through all 200 pages and do that for you. So
I wonder if there's a way to like select every odd page or every even page and just turn it. I don't know.
not that I know of. There's no way to do that.
I bet you there's a way. Friar Charles knows it.
Well, think about it.
I could tell him to do it again, but I just sent you that one in case you wanted to look at it anytime soon.
Well, that's great. That's a great text. I think it'd be, yeah, it's a wonderful text.
I thought it was wonderful. I started reading it.
Yeah, it is. Anyway, we should pray. Let's close for today. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing us to come together and to discuss the wisdom that you have expressed through your holy saint, Saint Bonaventure. We ask that he would intercede for us, help us to understand the truth that you have to teach us through this, and be with us this weekend, and help us to all walk ever closely and more closely to your Son through the example and mediation of his Blessed Mother. Amen.
Amen.
Have a good week. God bless.
Thank you, Jared. Bye. Thank you. For prayer.
Rick, can you send that commentary on Ecclesiastes, or Ecclesiastes, I'm not sure which one it is, to Father Lewis or
Yeah,
say
I'll get those things I scanned, and then that too to Father Lewis.
All right, thank you very much. And,
Okay.
if you wanted to